And so, hello everyone, welcome. Um, my name is Bradley Harper, as it says on my screen there. Uh, and this is are the historical fiction authors who like to mix things up a little bit. And we had an in-depth conversation, and I'm going to let each person introduce themselves in turn. That way I don't get anything wrong or miss something important. But I want to start with Katharine. Katharine, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Hello, I'm so glad that all of you are here today. I'm Katharine Schellman. I'm the author of the Lily Adler Mysteries. The first one came out last year, so I got to debut in the middle of a global pandemic, which was very exciting, very unexpected. Second one is coming out in July, so just about 4 months from now. Those are Regency murder mysteries, whodunits, so it's kind of like your favorite period drama, but with murder instead of marriage. And I am also going to be starting a new series next year. That's the Nightingale Mysteries, and they're set in Jazz Age New York.
Okay. Do you have a copy of your book to show us?
I do. It's right here. It's easy for me because I've got the one at this point. But the next one's coming out in just a few months, so I should be getting my copies any day now. I'm very excited for that.
Okay. Well, I've only got 2 books out myself, so welcome to the club. I was at a Killer Nashville, my very first author panel, and I was sitting next to Ann Perry, who has 85 books.
Oh my gosh.
And my first book was coming out in 6 weeks. And so I said to the audience, between the two of us, we have a broad spectrum of experience. All right, Eleanor, please.
I am the author of the Will Reese murder mysteries. They take place in the Federalist period in the new United States. That's roughly 1795. I had 1802 now. My most recent book, Death in the Great Dismal, came out in this past January. And I actually have Kelly to thank for that, because she mentioned the Dismal Swamp when I was at a previous Suffolk Mystery Festival. And I went to the swamp, and an amazing place. And so I had to write about it. So it's involves the escaped fugitives, the Maroons as they call. And it's actually number 9 in my series. I have number 10 coming out in a few months.
All right, excellent. Yeah, you can tell a real estate developer did not name that piece of real estate.
Yes.
He wanted to sell anything. Yes, it's right next to the Great Dismal Swamp. Okay, wonderful. All right, Bill, you're up next, man.
Thank you. Yeah, I am Bill Rapp, and the reason I'm on this panel is the Cold War spy thriller series that I write. There's 3 books out that start with the introduce the protagonist, Carl Bayer, who becomes a CIA officer. First book, Tears of Innocence, it starts us off in Berlin right after the war, followed by the Habsburg Variation in Vienna in 1955, and then the Budapest Escape, which is set in 1956 Hungary as the Hungarians revolt and the Soviets invade to repress it. And then the 4th book in the series, Berlin Walls, is coming out on November 9th. And that's the story there is set in Berlin as the wall is going up. And November 9th is a nice release date the publisher picked, because those of you who are familiar with German and Berlin history recognize that. Maybe it's the date. Most recent one is when the wall fell on November 9th in 1989. And I'm currently at work on the 5th book in this series, which takes Carl Bayer to an assignment in Hungary during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I rather stupidly forgot to bring any books down from the upstairs library, so I have none to show. But the reason I write, I started out writing private detective novels. I switched to the Cold War spy series because I spent 35 years in the CIA. I retired in 2017, but I still work as a part-time consultant and foreign trainer. I'm pushing 40 years with the place now. And I thought I could bring some of my own background and try and set the stories, give the proper context to intelligence work and espionage with policy and politics, all in the surface or in the service of policymakers in the United States and in our governments. And it's not just about assassins and late night meetings and whatnot, although there are plenty of late night meetings. It really has to do with our place and role in the U.S. government. And that's the sort of niche I hope to occupy with my series.
Yeah. Yeah, I was in Budapest on R&R when I commanded the 67th Cash, then in
Mhm.
Bosnia. And the buildings there still had the bullet holes from the uprising. The Russians did not let them plug those holes. They wanted them there as a daily reminder. This is what happened the last time you guys got out of line.
Yeah.
Okay, time to plug myself. I'm Bradley Harper. I'm retired U.S. Army colonel, physician, pathologist. I did 37 years, 4 months, and 9 days in the Army because I couldn't find honest work anywhere else. Came in on the infantry one day. I was on sick call. The doctor I saw was a jerk. Went home, told my wife, said, if that guy can make it through medical school, I think I can. And so there you are. I have 2 books, as I said. First book, Knife in the Fog. I put Arthur Conan Doyle on the trail of Jack the Ripper. It was an Edgar finalist for Best First Novel and won the Silver Falcon for Best Mystery in 2019. Second book, Queen's Gambit. Female character in the first book. It's a protagonist here. She tries to stop an assassination attempt on Queen Victoria during her Diamond Jubilee. And Silver Falcon paid the compliment of naming it Best Suspense and Book of the Year. And the first book is being pitched in Hollywood for possible TV series. No check yet. Okay. And then my last thing is I just, this is coming out in April, Mystery Writers of America on how to write a mystery. And they accepted a couple of my small contributions. Lee Child has about 30 times as much as I do in there. And I think that's probably a good choice, but at least my name is associated with this. And it is a very good book, even though I'm in it too. And finally, this is my erotic Gothic vampire comic book, which I made just for fun and grins, available at the Fountain Bookstore if you're into that sort of thing. And if you are, you don't have to tell me. Okay, and I think that's enough about me, although I could talk for a long time. All right, so Bill had a great opening question, which kind of gets to the heart of what it is we do. And it is how, there's historical fiction. Okay, so there's history and there's fiction. And where do you draw that line? So Bill, since this was your bright idea, I'm going to toss it to you first. How concerned are you with accuracy? Let me finish. Is it clearly necessary? It is clearly necessary, yes, but can it become a fetish? In other words, when do you feel you can take liberties with historical accuracy? Are you free to adjust timelines, locations, or more? All right, Bill, take it away.
Thanks, Bradley. The question came to me as I was working on this 5th novel, and there's I'm not sure who's familiar with Istanbul and Peripalas, which was a famous hotel. It was the end station for the Orient Express. And I set a scene in there, and I have the character, the protagonist, Harper, stay there. And I stayed there. The council had put me up there at one point when I was traveling through. And I remember I stayed in a room in the back, and I was up all night with heavy truck traffic. And I had to make me move to a room in the right, or in the front of the building. And also there was the hot water was irregular at best. And there was a wonderful symphony though from the pipes whenever you tried to run a bath. And I thought to myself, well, how accurate would this be for 1962? Was there a road behind the hotel where you got the heavy truck traffic? Would it be accurate for me to use that as a setting and to build the scene? And then I thought, well, yeah, so what? I'm gonna do it anyway. I'm not sure how accurate it is. I hadn't found anything on Peripalas and it's where it was placed in Istanbul at the time, what the construction was like or what the part of the text was like. And then in the Berlin novel, I kept wondering, what stage is the wall being built as the story goes along? Because when they first closed the wall, Berlin off, East Berlin off, it was just barbed wire and armed guards. It was a while before they actually constructed a brick wall. And I thought, am I responsible to the readers, as each day moved along to let them know if I make a reference to the wall, where it is in terms of its construction? And I decided to take liberties with that. It was close enough, particularly after the movie set on the Gillingham Bridge with Tom Hanks. I forget the name of it at the moment. But they set the building of the wall in the winter. It was in August when the wall went up. And so I thought if they can take those kinds of liberties, well, then I can do that here. I'd just be interested in how, if others draw a line somewhere in those terms.
Very good. Eleanor, would you care to respond?
Well, I'm a lifelong librarian, so I try very, very hard to be as accurate as possible. And I really struggle to make the clothing and what's happening politically and all of that absolutely perfect. What I have problems with is slang and names for things, because some of it, of course, we're still using, and it's from, Aesop's fables. But a lot of other things, if you used it now, nobody's going to understand it. Yet, so I have used a more modern term, and I've been flamed for it because it wasn't accurate. So where do you go? Where do you draw the line on trying to be accurate and trying to make your story understandable? That's the thing I struggle with all the time.
Okay, very good. Katharine?
I mean, I think it's a really tricky question because there's no way you're going to make everyone happy. Like you said, Eleanor, either someone's going to write in saying, I didn't understand what this character meant. You needed to use a different word, or someone's going to write in saying they didn't talk like that.
Right.
So
exactly.
I think the important balance to strike is, you have to get that it's historical fiction. So something's not, it's going to be pretend. It's going to be inaccurate to some degree because the goal is to tell a good story. And I think that also runs into the tricky problem of what we think of as accurate is often wrong. Or we have this very particular idea of what is historical accuracy? What were things like in the past? This amorphous past time. How did people talk? What did they do? And it's sometimes a very inaccurate sense of what is accurate. For example, one of my favorite things that terms, like in terms of vocabulary, like you were talking about slang, is the phrase hanging out, which sounds so modern to our ears. But people first started using it in the 18th century to describe, young men who had no jobs and nothing to do, spending all day at the coffee shop with their friends, talking about politics and horse racing and whatever they wanted to. So, you could have a character in the 1780s saying, oh, mama, where's Edward? Oh, he's hanging out at the coffee shop with all his useless friends. And that would be completely historically accurate. But someone's going to write in and say they didn't talk like that then. So it's, and I think those things I love. I love those moments where you're like, oh, we don't realize that this is actually going on there. Or I don't know if anyone in the audience is familiar with Deanna Raybourn, who is a marvelous author.
I love her. Yes.
One of her little anecdotes that I've heard that I love is that in her research, she discovered that in the 1880s, there was a lesbian commune in the middle of London. And not only it wasn't just a few lesbians, it was so many that they had their own newspaper. But, you put a lesbian in a story set in the 1880s in London, and someone's going to write in saying, stop imposing your modern concepts on 19th century. So I think what I strive for in my writing is not necessarily, strict historical accuracy, because, some things are going to be accurate and some things are going to not, but and some things you're not going to know if they're accurate or not. Some things there's no way of finding out. But I think that the better standard to strive for is historically possible. Like, could this person have been in this place, doing this thing, thinking this way, acting this way at this time? And I think way more often than we realize, the answer is yes. That is possible, that could have happened. And as a writer, I find that really exciting because it opens up so many stories to tell. And then there's also the little details, like, was there an alley at this point then? And maybe there wasn't, but if it makes a good story, I say go for it. And if you have to explain yourself, do it in your author's note.
Catherine, I got to just add on to that. I think on your last point, maybe there wasn't. Bottom line, I always think is, well, it's my world. And so if I want to put an alley there, I'll put an alley there. And the test is either is it historical possible. I would say, is it historically plausible so that you can justify it? And somebody once said, if you really want to get hammered by questions from readers, write something about railroads and guns in your books, because those are the people that really, really try and nail you on accuracy.
Well, I got flamed for using the word cracker, and I had found a written example of that in a letter in 1767, but I got people writing back and say they didn't use that then. That's a modern term. So I've had that experience that Katharine was talking about many times.
My own response to that is Well, first of all, I'm an historian. I think we all love history, or wouldn't be writing what we do. And I try to be, as you said, Bill, to be plausible. At the end of the day, the reader can say, "Well, it could have happened like that." In my first book, at one point, I have Mark Twain in London doing a reading, and my characters, attend that reading. I have no idea if Mark Twain was in London when Jack the Ripper was doing his thing or not, but he did come to London frequently and he did do readings, so why not? That sort of thing. I did have one lady who lives in London, who caught me on two mistakes. Of course, after the book is long out, at one point in my second book, I have my inspectors showing their badges. She said they don't have badges; they have cards, just like the FBI. They called warrant cards. Okay, and then another point, I make a reference to the tea room at Harrods, and I made absolutely certain that Harrods existed at the time I mentioned it. And the lady says, yes, but they didn't have a tea room for another 15 years. And so, okay, got me. What you gonna do? But I do like you said, I go for plausibility. The first book, since it was the Jack the Ripper, I certainly can't change the names of the victims or where or when their bodies were discovered. And I used the Scotland Yard inspector on the ground, Aberline. He's part of that story. And one of my harshest reviews after the book came out was a guy was furious that I used real people in my story. So they're just no satisfying everybody. But it is historical fiction. At the end of the day, like you said, it's my story, and I like your comment about that author's note. Oh, you can get out of so much trouble with that author's note. That's a get out of jail free card. Wonderful. Okay, next question. And this one I'll start with Katharine, so brace yourself. How do you give the reader a sense of place and time? And we already talked about slang, how that quickly fades and can confuse the reader. So anyway, I'll shut up and let you answer.
Well, that's tricky because, you want to make it an immersive world, because if someone's reading something that's set in a historical setting, it's because they love the history and they want to experience that time period, but you don't want to just throw unnecessary information and bog the story down, especially in a mystery that needs to have a certain degree of movement and momentum to it. So I think really, when it comes to time and place, I think everything should give you that sense, because when you think about it, they're so defined by where they are and what time they're in, how they dress, how they talk, how they interact with people, the assumptions that they have about the world, where they go, how they fill their leisure time, how they fill their non-leisure time. It's, time and place in a lot of ways it's like the air that we're breathing. It's in everything and we never are paying attention to it. So I think in historical mystery, it should be that air, that sense of everything giving you the time and place for both the characters and the readers without you necessarily needing to say, oh, and because it was this year, they were doing this. So I think it really permeates everything that you're writing.
Okay, very good. Eleanor.
I agree. I think that was really well said. I also try to center the stories in some degree with the politics of the time. Mm-hmm. I have my main character, who is a male weaver, thinking about politics regularly. And for example, in this one, in 1800, there's an election coming up between Jefferson and Adams, and it was a very hotly contested election. There was a lot of vitriol in the newspapers. I use the contemporary newspapers heavily, by the way. And so I have him reflecting on that and reflecting on what the newspaper said a couple of times during the story, so that you kind of get an idea of what year it is. And I almost never describe their clothing. What I'll say is something like, the sun is shining down, so she pushed the hood of her cloak back. Or he put on his greatcoat because it was very cold. So I try to center it in the weather and what they are doing that any human being would be doing at that time. It's tricky though, because you don't want the information dump.
That is always a real challenge. Bill, yeah. How about you, man?
I have one advantage with my Cold War spy series, in the sense that it's the setting is usually familiar to the reader. They're, European cities or in fairly contemporary events. So my challenge then is to remove the impression people might have of contemporary London, Paris, Vienna, Berlin, Istanbul, and Ankara, and create the one that's going as the city existed at the time. And what I do is, one of the things that, as Eleanor mentioned, I have an advantage if I'm referring to the events of the Hungarian Revolt and the Soviet invasion, or the construction of the Berlin Wall, or the immediate peacetime in the ruins of Berlin in 1945. So I can use those sort of references, and settings, and whatnot, and the backdrops to give people that sense of time and place. So that's an advantage I have. The challenge, of course, is that there are a lot of people very familiar with those towns and with those events, and I have to be very careful in how I construct those scenes, which leads us back to the very first question we had. As this continuous loop. How do you answer that challenge? But like I say, it helps to have cities that people are remotely familiar with, and events that are remotely familiar with.
Yeah, I had a real advantage that most people who like crime novels are familiar with the world of Sherlock Holmes. So they already have that world in their head. So I just have to make slight references, to the fog, to the blood running in the street from the horse abattoir, the smells, and people, and they've got, what do you call them, modular prefab. They have a prefab construct in their head that I could just make a reference to, and their brains would finish it for me. So I had several people tell me how my writing, I made the time and place a character in the story, but I had a lot of advantages there. I do like to put small details in, which kind of give the reader a feeling of how things are different now than then. One of the things was, the Sherlock Holmes stories, Watson and Holmes are always taking a hansom cab. Okay, fine. That I had no idea. A hansom cab is two wheels. The driver is up on top. He has a lever, and you have these folding doors that let you in and out. And you don't get out until you've paid the driver up through the roof or whatever. But a young man and a young woman, unless they were married or related, would not ride in a hansom cab together. That was considered too intimate. They would ride in a Morgan carriage, which is also called a growler, which is more enclosed, which I would think, if anything, you're going to be hanky-panky would be better. But it's called a growler because of the sound of the four wheels going over the cobblestones. So Hansom and Watson would take a hansom. Watson and Holmes would take a hansom because it was small and nimble and could get through the traffic much better than the larger, more expensive carriage. So little details like that give the reader an insight into the world that my characters are inhabiting. And I like to, plus I'm a real nerd anyway. I find that sort of stuff, oh, that's cool. So I try to work it in there some way. Now, not always successfully, but anyway, there you go. Okay, I got some good questions and comments here. And no, I'm not going to write about somebody knocking Santa off the roof. No, that ain't going to happen. But thanks for playing. And Heather and John Didakis, hi, my friends. Good to see you. I will look at the questions as we get towards the end, but we're going to move on to the next one now. And this one, okay, Eleanor, your turn to be first. Why did you pick the time and place that you did for your stories?
Well, I'll tell you, you all write in foreign countries, don't you? And I think a lot of the writer friends that I have do. So many write in the Victorian times and all of that. I wanted to write about my country, and I wanted to write about a time that was not a war. So I chose a time when a traveling weaver could be gainfully employed, which already set the time because that ended pretty much around 1816. And I chose, and because I know something about hand weaving, I have several looms, and until my books took off, that was one of my hobbies. So I had a time and a place, and I had a male weaver. And not only because I knew something about it, but I didn't want him to always be in the same location. I call it the Cabot Cove curse, a little tiny town in Maine and innumerable dead bodies on the front stoop. So I wanted him to have the option of traveling. and going different places, and my 10-year-old brain having adventures. So I chose a time that was not too far away from the American Revolution, but before the War of 1812 and before, of course, the Civil War. And I started doing my research only to discover that many of the reasons that those wars happened were actually present and in a way already starting to be problems in the late 18th century and early 19th century. So I find it absolutely fascinating. I love the fact that there are a lot of newspapers from that time that you can peruse and see what the tone is, and really find out what people were thinking about during that time. One of the things that stunned me is they're full of advertisements for escaped slaves. I did not know that. And I put that into several of my books. So I really ended up loving this period. My characters are moving forward year by year. And it's really fascinating historically, even though it's not a war. And there's a lot of ferment and a lot of things happening. So I ended up loving this period.
Very good. Well, Bill, I think for you it's pretty obvious, but I'll let you give us your answer.
Sure.
Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I should mention that I started my adult life as an academic historian on modern Europe. So, a modern European setting makes a lot of sense. And it's the Cold War. I find it a very interesting time because it's both for the agency and for our country. I mean, for the agency, we were learning to become a peacetime intelligence organization, transitioning from the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, of the Second World War. And it was a real challenge. And frankly, it took us a while to get there. We had our successes, but we also had our fair share of failures, learning the real role of an intelligence organization. And in terms for our country, it was when America emerged from its isolationism and really became the world leader and led the way in constructing the post-war order that from which I think we've all benefited. But it also was not an easy transition for us. I mean, we had to learn as we went along, and some might say we're still learning. We still are. It's an existential journey. So that's why I found that such an obvious choice. And fortunately, at least for me, Europe was the front line of the Cold War, and cities like Berlin, in Germany, where I spent a number of years, it just made a lot of sense for me to that time for this series.
Yeah, writing what you had experienced your own self. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, one of the cardinal rules you learn early on is write what you know, and well, I certainly know modern Europe and the Cold War.
All right, great. Katharine, how about you?
I loved Eleanor's answer about wanting to write something that was set in the US, because that was a big change for me from my first series to my second. Second is going to come out next year, so a little while to wait on that one. But for me, because time and place is so essential to character and like who a person is and how they think about the world. And I always start with characters. I always see a character in the time period that they're from. Like that's one of the first things I know, because who you are is so dependent on where and when you are. And so for my first series, for the Lily Adler books, I knew right away where she lived and when, like that was just essential to the character and the circumstances that she found herself in. And then I had a friend ask me like, well, why are crime novels always set in London? And I was like, well, they're not always. There's a lot of people writing a lot of things out there. But a lot of it's British crime novels are their own genre basically. And so I thought like, okay, if I'm writing in the US, who do I want to write about? If I'm not going to be writing in Britain, I want to write something in my own country. Kind of like you were saying, Eleanor, like I want to do something in a world that's a little more home to me. But I also wanted it to be historical. And I immediately had this idea of this working class character. And because I had this sense of who she was, I knew when she lived, and it was Jazz Age New York. And so for me, picking the time and place is really dependent on the character. But for the second one, it was a little bit of a deliberate choice at the same time to switch countries there.
And my response to that is I had an idea for a story involving Arthur Conan Doyle and Jack the Ripper. The Ripper Murders. His first book came out in '87, Study in Scarlet, and the next Holmes story didn't come out to 1890. Doyle only got 25 pounds for the first book, had to surrender copyright, was so disgusted, he said, I'll never write another crime story, waste of time. Of course, in '88, in that interim between the first book and the second Holmes story, the Ripper does his thing and then mysteriously disappears, never knowingly being caught. So I conceived of an idea of how I could explain why Doyle returned to writing Sherlock Holmes and why the Ripper stopped as suddenly as he started without knowingly being caught, and linking those two events. So I was pretty much timed. The event I wrote about pretty much locked me into that specific time and place. Then the second book, since I wanted to use my female character, Margaret Harkness, who was a real person, in the second story, I was looking around. What I did was I went to Wikipedia and I looked at, okay, 1881, 1882, 1883, what big events happened. I hit 1897, the Diamond Jubilee for Queen Victoria. I said, oh, interesting. The anarchists were busy around then. She survived 7 attempts on her life. So I decided to, basically I took Frederick Forsyth's novel, The Day of the Jackal, set it in Victorian England, made my assassin, rather than a cold-blooded mercenary, into a guy who's being manipulated by the anarchists, and basically rewrote the story around the procession of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. So I like to relate my stories to real events, real people. So I find an event that strikes my fancy, and I go for that. I was working on another story about the theft of the Irish Crown jewels from Dublin Castle in 1910. Doyle's cousin was the guardian and was blamed for malfeasance, and Doyle offered to help to try to recover the jewels. He wasn't taken up on his offer, but in my story, of course, he was going to. My agent didn't like it, so I dropped it. But like I said, I like to tie myself to real events. So anyway, enough about that. The next question: what issues does your main character deal with that's still pertinent today? Or phrased differently, why would a modern reader care about the issues your main character faces in your stories? And I'll go first this time. My first book is narrated as a memoir by Arthur Conan Doyle. And he's his latter years of life. And one of the main characters, and I think the person that the story is really about, is Margaret Harkness, who was a real person. She was an author, a suffragette, and she's living in Whitechapel during the Ripper murders because she wrote about the working poor. She wanted to live the lives of her characters so she could portray them more accurately. And of course, she deals with the misogyny of the time and the classism of England. And in truth, she wrote mainly under the name John Law because no one would buy her books with her own name on it. And I think those are all themes which are still very pertinent today. And I found Margaret to be in real life, to be such a strong and interesting character that I wanted other people to know about her as well. So that's my answer to that. And Eleanor, I'll take it to you.
Of course, I have a story arc that goes in the background of all the mysteries, although the mysteries basically stand alone. And in my head, I call it the maturation of Will Reese, who starts out as quite a different character in the first book than he becomes. He gets married, he marries a former Shaker. And in the book before Death in the Great Dismal, The Circle of Dead Girls, beginning of the circus in this country, Will Reese he turns 40 that year, and he's attracted to a circus performer, a tightrope walker. And in Death in the Great Dismal, partly they go to Virginia because Lydia feels that they need to get away and kind of patch their marriage back together. I think those are pretty common themes and pretty accurate for what might be happening to my character. They also go through other life changes. They have children. She's pregnant now, in fact. They adopt children. Things happen to the children. They leave one town because Lydia, as a former Shaker, is accused of witchcraft, and they move to a different town. None of those I think are that unusual to a modern eye. I also talk about other things like immigration. In The Circle of Dead Girls, the circus is made up of people who are outsiders for one reason or another. There are Jews, there are immigrants from Italy who've been driven out by Napoleon and the war. There are circus performers. All of them are people who have no other place to go. Again, pretty common theme. They're refugees of a sort. So I think the characters and what they're going through have to be relatable. But I also think people don't change. I think that that's one reason why you can change your historical context, but your characters are still can be very plausible and very believable to a modern eye. And that's what I try to do. And I try to address some things that are happening in our current world that have echoes in the world that I've set up. In Death in the Great Dismal, for example, Will Reese is a white man from the North who goes to Virginia and has experiences in the Great Dismal Swamp in a community of escaped slaves. So one of the reviews I got said, Will Reese discovers that Black Lives Matter, which wasn't quite where I was going, but kind of,
Yeah.
So I think that it's important to have your characters deal with what I think of as real life issues, even while they're detecting a murder.
All right, great. All right, Katharine, you're up.
I think that's so true. That really hits the nail on the head there, and that's the idea that people don't change. And I think, like, from time period to time period, obviously over the course of their lives they change, but I think this question really gets to the heart of why I personally love genre fiction, because you take characters and you put them in these really out of the ordinary situations, and it's so much fun to write about and to read about, but then you use that to explore these very relatable, very human issues that just continue to resonate basically no matter when you're reading it. My main character, Lily Adler, she starts off the first book as a widow who, because her husband died very unexpectedly, she's in the second half of her 20s, which in Regency England was, a bit of an interesting time to be a single woman. And she's suddenly trying to figure out what's she going to do with her life now that everything she had planned is basically not going to happen. And well, the out of the ordinary comes in that what she ends up doing is solving a murder, and that's not something most people would do to deal with like trauma and grief, like go out there and figure out who done it. But that idea that you have to figure out, okay, my plan A didn't work out. What's my plan B? Like, that is such a human experience. That is something every single person has to do at some point in their life, probably several times. You've got to find plan C and D too. You've got someone dealing with trauma and grief and trying to figure out, how do I work through that and continue to build a life that I feel good about? And that's something we all have to do at some point too. So I love the way that you have the fun of these really over the top situations sometimes, but then you can really ground them in these very human experiences that can really resonate with a lot of people.
That's a great answer. All right, Bill.
Yeah, I guess my answer is fairly similar to the one for the previous question. That it's I think that hopefully it speaks to readers today, because it is related to the world we're in today, very close to it. It's the origins of the world we're in today. Of course, the challenge is I don't want to make these didactic stories. I want to make them entertaining stories, and hopefully that resonance would be there, because it is so close to the world we live in today, and the headlines you see in the newspapers today about our relationship with Russia, China, the transatlantic relationship, and the role of intelligence in government. So hopefully I merge those two together.
Yeah. I think what von Clausewitz said is intelligence work, although he meant war, but I think intelligence work is also diplomacy by other means.
Oh yeah, definitely, most definitely.
Yeah, and human nature hasn't changed. I remember reading once that there was a Roman senator back in the days of ancient Rome. They had property tax, but they had exemption that any building used for religious purposes was exempt. So a Roman senator's favorite horse died. He had it buried underneath his house. They called his house a temple in memory of his horse. So So like I said, people really haven't changed all this time. All right. Okay, this is the famous rabbit hole question, and we'll go right back to you, Bill. What kind of research do you do for your stories? How much is too much? What surprised you the most when you were researching a story?
I'll try and do this real quickly. I mean, obviously, I'll read a lot about the period. I've got a lot of background already, but the surprising thing to me is how much I forget and how much relearning I have to do. Just one anecdote on that. When we were living in London and I was working on the Habsburg variation, set primarily in Vienna, my wife said, you better go back to Vienna. It's been a while since you've been there, refresh your memory of the cities. And I thought, well, come on, I've been to Vienna a number of times. Vienna's a great city. How can I forget anything? And it was surprising how much I had to learn, how much revision I had to do on various scenes when I got back home after being in the city. So it's, I guess that's part of the joy, is that you never stop learning on this stuff. So that brings a measure of satisfaction.
All right, Katharine.
I'll try to have a speedy answer too, so we have time for audience questions. Although I think someone in the chat did ask this one also, which is great. I find personally that there's sort of two phases of research. There's the research you do before you start writing, and then there's the research you have to do while you're writing when you realize you don't know a detail and have to check it. And it makes me so grateful that so many museums have put so many things on Google now, because that makes that so much faster. But I think that part of the research basically never stops. Like, I'll be in copy edits and be like, oh no, I didn't check that one detail, and I've got to check it right now just to make sure it's correct. But in terms of like the rabbit hole that you can fall in before you start writing, I think for me, the point where I stopped researching and realized that I have to just start writing a story down is when the research isn't changing the story I'm going to tell. Because you can always learn more. Like, you can always find some other source to go to or some other fascinating fact about the time period. But at some point they stop changing your story. And I think that's the point when I have to start writing.
That's a great answer. I'm going to remember that one. Eleanor,
It's
please.
hard to do.
Oh, I agree. I mean, I do a lot of reading and a lot of research, and I also try to visit all the places that my character goes. So I have a very clear sense of the geography and what it feels like there. When I wrote Death in Salem, I went to Salem a number of times, and I went to the swamp 3 or 4 times, took the tours, did all of that. So I had a feeling of how the air felt. So, but it is very hard to give up the research. And I agree with Katharine. I keep doing it over, until the book is really in the hands of the publisher.
All right. In my own case, I read a couple of books about Jack the Ripper. And then one of the authors of one of the books, I started a correspondence with him. He does a walking tour company, walking tour of Whitechapel at night. And I bought out the tour, and one night, so just him and myself. And the thing that surprised me the most was Mary Kelly was the 5th and final victim, and she had her own little apartment, and that's where she was murdered. And so when her body was discovered, it coincided with the installation of the Lord Mayor of London about 1.5 miles away. And so news of that another Ripper victim had been discovered ran through the crowd as people dressed in their finest, Sunday suits go from this ceremony before it's even over. And there were thousands of people outside this poor part of London, outside this courtyard, to watch this woman being removed in this simple wooden box. And the image of the contrast of those two occasions going on simultaneously within about 1.5 miles of each other, I found very striking. And so I cut back and forth between the Lord Mayor in his ermine-lined robe and the music and all these people standing in total silence. And I had the sound of the music being faintly heard as her body comes out. And that was one of the scenes I was proudest of, because I just thought the contrast of those two. And it was not in the book. I didn't see it anywhere else. I wouldn't have known that if I had taken that walking tour with that particular gentleman. So I have an author's assistant who does my newsletter and some other stuff. She's offered to do the research for me. I say, oh no, because oftentimes when I'm looking for something, I'll find something completely unexpected which will take me in a new and better direction. So that's the one thing I says, as long as I'm writing, I'll do the research myself. Thank you very much. She's great, but that's my job. Okay, I'm going to look quickly at the questions here, see what we have.
There was something
Okay.
about aging, I think.
Okay, you're a little bit, okay. Okay, I'm sorry. What did you say?
There was a question about aging in the chat.
Oh, aging.
There's aging.
Well, okay, I've seen better days.
Oh,
Go ahead.
how do you deal with your characters aging in a period where life expectancy was so short?
Okay. Anybody want to grab that?
Well, my character is aging, but one of the things in the Circle of Dead Girls, he goes through kind of a change of life kind of thing. Is his father died at 46, and of course the lifespan that then was 40. But there were people who lived older into their 90s. So, I try to have them be aware of their aging and aware that, the end of life is coming. But at the same time, I plan to keep them going a lot longer than the average age. So it is tricky. And you do get pushback from readers who want to know why all of this is happening when they're only 40. Different lifespan now and then.
Yeah. On my second book, it's 11 years after the Ripper. And in real life, Margaret had some disease, which I decided to call lupus. And so I make mention of her limited mobility and how it's starting to hinder her. So she gets involved in some daring do, but she doesn't go chasing after the bad guy down the street anymore like she could have 11 years sooner. I'm sorry, Katharine, you're about to say something.
Oh, I was going to say, I think it's also important to remember that when you look at life expectancy statistics, those averages are really thrown off in a lot of eras by child and infant mortality.
That's right. And of course, everyone got sick a lot
easier. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But women were really likely to die in childbirth for a lot of history. But if you made it past that point, you probably lived to your 60s and you were in great shape. So it's just, if you make it past these certain milestones, you're probably fine.
Yeah, that's right.
All right. Somebody asked, how long does it take to write a book?
Depends on the book.
Apparently it takes 3 weeks.
That long? You must be very meticulous, Brad.
In my case, I'm good for about one book per year.
Same here. It's come to about a year. And of course, that depends on the editors.
Yeah, deadlines make a difference. My first book, which I was writing with no deadlines because I didn't have an agent or a publisher yet, I wrote over, I think, 3.5 years. And then the second book I wrote in 2.5 months. So
wow. My first book took over 2 years. But part of that was constant revision.
Yeah.
I'm fortunate in that respect. I do not have deadlines. So it's
all right.
I'm lucky there.
Question: do deadlines help or hurt the process? And I'll just say that Agatha Christie said her house was never cleaner than when she had a deadline looming over her.
I can relate.
I do all my laundry.
Anybody else want to respond to that?
They both, I think. Deadlines help and hurt. They make you efficient and they make you panic.
Right.
As I said, I'm fortunate. I don't have to face those.
Okay, there's a question here. How do you deal with historical speech patterns, accents, and idioms? And I'll take that if you don't mind. I touch on it. You don't want it to become repetitious. You don't want it to, like in my first book, Professor Doyle, who was the inspiration for Sherlock Holmes, is one of the three major characters investigating the murders. So whenever he's very frustrated, his Scottish brogue, he's got to thrill his R's, and it comes out. So I cue the reader early on, have Doyle comment on that's a marker that he's stressed out. But I don't every single time he speaks, I don't, refer to his Scottish accent. I just, touch on it here or there for dramatic effect. So I think you can really bore the reader pretty quickly if you try to have them talk, for example, like a person in that era. You want to use words which and expressions and speech patterns which are easily relatable. You don't want to pull the reader out of the world that you're trying to create. So you want to make it as simple as understandable as possible. And anybody else want to say anything more about that?
We also don't want to have a 700-page book because everything went on a lot longer.
That is very true.
I would just say that an advantage I have is cable television. I can watch shows and movies from the period in which I've set the stories in the 50s and 60s, which helps a lot. My challenge, though, is when I have foreigners speaking English for the American audience. What sort of accents and constructions do you put on their sentence? That can be a tough one.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, another quick question. Do you get the idea for the book first and then decide the time to set it, or the other way around? You come up with the time first and then you decide what story to tell?
I think it depends on the book. If you've got a series, then your time period's pretty set.
Yeah.
Yeah, in my case, obviously, the story I had to tell could only happen in that one particular time. And the second one, of course, the Diamond Jubilee, again, I had the idea and the time kind of came together. You know, we couldn't have one without the other. And I think that's it. Okay, this is the first time I've moderated an author panel. So, you know, if you want to fire me after this, I'll understand. But I had a good time. Anybody want to wrap up? Bill, you want to wrap up, Mr. Rapp?
No, I just want to, I thank everyone. I thought it was a good discussion, great perspectives. I think the advantage too is that we all are writing different stories and different time sets. And so I think the audience probably benefited from these different perspectives and different challenges, different way we responded to challenges of writing historical fiction. And I know I learned from it. So I hope others did. And I enjoyed it. And I thank everyone.
All right. Eleanor.
I thought it was great. I always end up with a list of books to look up and read too. Thank you all.
All right.
Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Bill and Eleanor and Bradley. This was great. Had so much fun.
And thank you, Katie.
All right. Next time we're together, the